Hello, welcome to another of our Creative Confidence series. I'm thrilled today to have Ilya with me.
Good morning.
Dear friend and somebody who I've worked extraordinarily closely with over the years here at IDEO. And today we are excited to start to answer some of the questions that we've heard from a lot of people about if they're tackling something that's not a product, that's not a hard object, it drops when you break it. How do they use design thinking, and especially how do they use prototyping? So today is all about stories, tips, and tricks for how you can move from ideas to action, even when you're dealing with something beyond a product. And so with that, I wanted to, Ilya came to IDEO at a time when we were really shifting beyond product design. So I thought it would be fun to have you start off just sharing a little bit about the trajectory you've seen IDEO on over the last many years.
Sure. So I've been at IDEO now for 21 years, which blows my mind every time I say it out loud. But IDEO has evolved quite a bit, as I think design has over that time. And really, when I joined, the firm's primary work was around the creation of products. As Sue says, things that make a noise when you drop them. And we did a lot of work in healthcare and in consumer products, and a lot of tech products like computers and PDAs, early days of PDAs and that sort of thing.
Those were early mobile devices, for those of you who don't know.
Right, sorry, not public display of affection, but personal digital assistant, yes, back in the day. I joined a very fledgling group focused around the design of physical spaces that were meant to be containers for branded experiences. So it's sort of an early foray into the design of brands, the design of service experiences, and that became much more mainstream over the years as my time here progressed. And I think as the requests that our clients were bringing to us became more and more complicated, and the service experiences that we were designing became more and more complicated, we added more and more different sorts of disciplines in order to be able to make those services come to life. So everything from brand designers to business designers to people who tell stories in a narrative form that sort of reflect the arc of an experience, through now to organizational designers who help think about designing the underpinning organizational systems that allow a system to kind of grow and evolve as the market changes.
Yeah.
So
this morning, I know you are, amongst many passions that he has, Ilya is very passionate about cars. And so we were talking about like all the different aspects of cars and automotive design that we've worked on. So definitely think about the design of the car. That's certainly the product, and other aspects of it, and the interior of the car, and the electronics and digital aspects of the car. But then you think about the service. We'll show some images of something that we just worked on at IDEO called SweetWorks, where it is a system to care for your car when it breaks down. And then you think about entire mobility systems in cities.
Yeah.
And caring for the flow of a city, which is much more system design level.
Yeah.
Great. So if you were to try to take a crack at defining what service design means to you, how would you talk about it?
I think service design is, think of it as the kind of intangible aspects of how an organization seeks to build a relationship over time with its customers. And customers can be end consumers, they can be business to business, there can be a whole bunch of different kinds of customers that you're trying to create a relationship with over time. But I think that over time is key. I think that the idea that it's this sort of collection of important moments that an organization owns in order to cultivate that relationship and evolve that relationship as it changes over time.
Nice. Great. I think some of the things that we see people struggling with are that those relationships can be so intangible.
Yeah.
And yet one of the primary elements of design thinking and that philosophy of tackling change is that we bring tangibility through prototypes. We make things real, not because
Yep.
they'll be perfect out of the starting gates, but to get feedback, to bring about collaboration, to gain buy-in or collaboration from others in the organization.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd start off by just showing a couple of images just to help people understand what are the different ways that we make things tangible and service designers make things tangible. And then we'll dive into a couple different projects that Ilya has been a part of here. So we'll pull up a few things. So one of the things that we often talk about is just designing a scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got an image up here of a really rough-hewn comic strip-like thing. This is a healthcare service. And so some of the things, I mean, would you do things like this when you're designing services?
Absolutely. I think, again, just the idea that something transpires over time, whether it's within a given service interaction, like something in a healthcare environment like that's depicted here, or something that transpires over a much longer period of time. Like think about an insurance organization and how, there are these punctuating moments of engagement that need to feel stitched together, even though they may not happen there may be years between those engagements.
Yeah, we have another image here. Some of these are stories that we dive into in the From Ideas to Action course. This is one of my favorite pieces of work where we're designing the interior of a long haul airline experience. And we essentially used our bodies and something very close to improv to feel out how close could you get to other people when you're sleeping. A few more, yeah.
I think we discovered that this was not a great solution.
A little too close.
Yeah.
And we'll go on to a few more. This one is really interesting. I think you have some insight into what this was prototyping.
Yeah, so this is a quick serve restaurant experience in which we were trying to essentially remap the flow of customers moving into and through the, in this case, restaurant, and the flow of employees and goods as they were producing the food, and trying to intersect those two things in a really new and interesting way that actually was both more efficient and just a higher quality experience.
Yeah.
And you can see how rough this began. And, it's some combination of physical elements like furnishings and counters and the roles that people are playing and the placement of those people in the system, and then the communications that go along with it.
Yeah, and I think some of the things that we find when you're prototyping a service, you're finding any way tangible to bring it to life so that you can think through unintended consequences, right, emotional aspects of things, all of those other things that are just so hard if you're trying to do it in a spreadsheet or in a document or mapping, or even just
hypothetically in your mind.
Yeah. There's one more here that we wanted to show that's a new piece of work. This is the car service that we were talking about. With this is just showing how with one order higher level of illustration, and this also became a little video that could be used to pass around the multiple touch points of an experience for what it's like to provide a car service. So showcasing how you can show a digital moment on a mobile device, a human moment of new roles that are being brought in there, and really bring an entire service to life. So these are just some things to get the conversation started. I think we'd love to also have some of you share different services that you've prototyped and different methods that you've used in the chat stream as well. And so we'll come back to more questions as well. But I thought another thing we'd do to get the conversation a little deeper is to hear Ilya talk about some of his favorite service design projects that he's worked on. So I thought we'd start off with one that's near and dear to all of us here at IDEO, the work we've done at Kaiser Permanente.
So the very first piece of work that we did with Kaiser was to look at the prenatal experience. So essentially the entire journey from finding out that you're pregnant through to leaving the hospital with your newborn. So, that's probably a 10-month, well, maybe not quite, experience. And in particular, we found that a big area of opportunity was to look at that moment after delivery, but before a mother and baby have left the hospital and go home. And so the postpartum experience was what we focused in on. And this is an example of a prototype that we created for a service that was meant to be delivered in that sort of 24 to 48 hour period. Mm-hmm. And on the left, you can see an extremely rough thing that looks like a game board that was meant to reflect to a mother all the things that needed to happen to her baby before, and her, not just her baby, but the things that needed to get done in that 24 to 48 hour period. And essentially as a kind of a for your information like solution that would be mounted on a wall in the room with the mom. And then fast forward to the thing that actually ultimately got implemented. This product really called the Journey Home Board was cast in a bigger service experience, which was the nurses and various people who contributed to getting a mom and her baby out of the hospital would come in and flip over a whole variety of cards that were essentially like a menu of the things that needed to happen before they could leave. So that at a glance, a mom could look up and say, where am I in my journey? How much more do I have to do? And goodness, I don't even know what that is. What is that? So there were a lot of things that we learned in doing this. And just one very short story, and maybe we can talk about other things, but one very short story is that in the initial prototyping of this Journey Home Board, there was a lot of concern that it would cause a lot of confusion for moms, and that we would end up getting a lot of new work coming out of it for the nurses on a floor. So we did a very simple thing. We hung paper versions of it in 3 patient rooms and asked a nurse on duty to essentially mark down the number of phone calls to the front desk that they received from those rooms and from rooms that the board wasn't in. And we discovered that moms in the rooms with the paper prototypes had 60% fewer questions.
That's cool.
So that was a pretty good indicator that this service offer was going to make a lot of sense for them.
Yeah, and what I hear in that is something that we see often. It's that we know it's so easy with early prototypes to race toward metrics and evidence, but we really see this moment of early indicators that something's going to be better are critical with these rough prototypes early on. How do you get, whether it's anecdotes or just little peek at evidence that you might be able to scale? And that's a great way to catalyze a bit more buy-in, at least take you to the next steps, and to flow through from something that's a rough-hewn poster that you work out with yourselves, hang in a patient room, and then eventually becomes a part of the service experience. I know I've seen this in hospitals. Kaiser Permanente is pretty dominant here in California, and it is a really elegant solution to helping the flow for somebody in a potentially confusing healthcare moment.
There was a really interesting thing we learned as a benefit to the care providers as well, which was they would come into a patient's room and check the board to know what still needed to be done and whether or not their services were required in that room. And we found that it actually created a much more efficient use of care providers' time where they sort of self-organize so as not to be in each other's way, which was another really interesting indicator of as Suz says, this is a kind of, it triggered a sense of like confidence in this as a solution for Kaiser.
Nice. Well, we'll move on to it. I'm definitely seeing lots of things in the chat. Somebody saying they would have loved this when they had their first child.
Right.
So thank you for that. And lots of people sharing different ways that they're prototyping. I think we'll move on. We've got 2 more stories to dive in a little more deeply to, just in different industries, so that people can have lots of ideas to build forward. So the next one we have this morning is from Interbank. So this is in Peru. And so we'll move forward to that one and have Ilya share a little bit about what he knows on this one.
So Interbank is an organization that we've worked with for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's a retail bank. So think, Umpqua, B of A, Wells Fargo, any of those kinds of things that currently is primarily in Peru. And they asked us to help them create both a new retail service experience for their bank-going customers, but then also to create a new innovation capability so that the bank could keep evolving that service design over time. So the very first bank that was created was called Explora. And so it's both a kind of lab for service design, but also a model for the future of service design that ultimately ended up being spread across the hundreds of banks that they have built across the country. And a couple of really interesting things. People queue up in Peru like nobody's business. If you go to pay a phone bill, you'll queue up for 45 minutes. If you go to a bank, you'll queue up for half an hour. If you go to a movie, you'll queue up for an hour. Though that's a very typical socially accepted norm, we wanted to create a different kind of experience that differentiated. So we broke that down with essentially a number system that allowed people to sit and wait in a much more comfortable lobby. And it allowed us also to prototype new sorts of product offerings and communications of those product offerings. So what you see in the upper right image of the thing on the screen right now is a set of shelves on which there were discrete physical products that allowed you to essentially pick up and buy a savings account or a checking account or some sort of other offer that communicated their products in a much more tangible form. And then also you'll notice that there's no glass between the teller and the customer, which for us feels very normal. In Peru, this was quite new. And so we spent a lot of time working to create ways to connect the client and the teller much more directly. This is going to sound so incredibly simple, but one of the things that we did was to create a little teeny whiteboard on which the teller could write down something that they cared about. And that became an icebreaker for the engagement between the teller and the customer. And fast forward to where we are today, the concepts are spread across all their banks, and they've seen significant lift in positivity around customer experience and their net promoter scores, and also incredible gains in efficiency. So all in all, I think quite successful.
Yeah, nice. And on this one, I can see we have a few questions about
Sure.
any testing. I know in the next example we have, there's some testing, but with Interbank Explora, there was also concept testing and pulling customers through.
Most definitely. So the very first form of this build out was in, plywood and white painted walls and things like that to essentially get the basic flow down correctly. There's some very, very simple technology tools that were introduced to allow people to manage that queuing process in new ways. And as I said, this is actually a test bed for service experience for the bank writ large. So the staff here, about 20% of their time is dedicated to actually evolving the service offer. And they have weekly check-ins where they sit down with people in their internal innovation team to debrief on the things that they've been learning with regards to new ideas that they're testing in the flow of the service. So it's kind of a permanent testing capability.
Cool. I think that's great. So not just there, but it's a new role that can be involved in bringing this to life.
Yeah, it's a new corporate capability for them.
Yeah. I'll go into one more example and then a couple different tips and tricks. So we've got one more example here that really showcases, I think in the Interbank Explorer, you're seeing a later stage prototype. We thought it would be fun to show something that's medium stage. So this is some work we did on reinventing the pharmacy experience for Walgreens, one of the largest pharmacies in the US. And if you could share a little bit about what's going on in this service prototyping.
So the big idea was that if you go into, I don't know how this is in other parts of the world, but certainly in the United States, when you walk into a pharmacy or a drugstore where you would get drugs and prescriptions filled, the pharmacist, who's a scientist and somebody who really has a deep knowledge, is often hidden away behind glass, out of view from the customers. and very hard to access. And so the big idea in this concept was to pull the pharmacist out into the center of the space and make him or her into a health coach and equipping them with all the materials, the spaces, the technology tools in order to be an effective coach. And so what you see on the left is an initial prototype for the physical environment, which actually did some really interesting things by taking out shelving displays, which is, for those of you who know this industry, is the life's blood of this kind of business. So there was a strong business argument that needed to be made for this. But perhaps more importantly are the images on the right, which show, particularly the upper right, a whole set of executives and people who own these pharmacies and are responsible for them as businesses coming through and having direct experiences of how this new service gets orchestrated and delivered. So it takes it off the spreadsheet and puts it into people's hearts in a way that I think made it very, very compelling for them to sign off on it. And the new design is now being rolled across the network of pharmacies in the US.
I think that's such an excellent point, that a major aspect of designing a service and why prototyping is so powerful is because you're aligning the needs of the end users, the customers, the recipients of the service with the capabilities inside of the organization. And so you need to rally both sides of this equation in a unique, innovative direction. And so a scaled up prototype of one of these experiences is an elegant way to get everybody on board.
Absolutely. And asking, I think as importantly, asking good questions about how things actually would play out, often starting to engage the ultimate stakeholders as designers in the delivery of the service can be very, very helpful for buy-in, but certainly effective execution.
Great. So I think we'll take down the stories now. And I just wanted to get, I know you've designed so many different services, digital services, human-powered services, services in an environment. And so when you're working with a team and you're trying to guide them to get started, what are some of the things that you ask them to do to help them think about how to get tangible with a service experience?
Goodness. Lots of things. I think we've talked a little bit about this already in this conversation, but thinking about the arc of the experience over time and how that plays out, not just in the moments that punctuate the delivery of value, but in those interstitial moments where, how do you help people remember you? How do you help people think about and prepare for and anticipate the next engagement moment? So that sort of time-based view is definitely a stance that I think design teams ought to take.
Yeah, I know a lot of times we we'll have a team kind of think out what's the ideal type, what's the idealized experience.
Indeed.
And so some of those early sketches or acting, I can see a lot of people are saying they've done things where they act out the service or make a really rough video and go for perfection. But then sometimes I'll see teams that everything will be dialed up to the nines, and so it's like, wow, it's hard to afford to deliver something at that level all the way through. How do you help a team make tough choices about what to prioritize in a service?
It's a phrase that we like to use, which is the moments that matter most. And, most organizations want to be awesome at everything all the time. And if you've ever actually tried to map out what that would actually cost, it's pretty prohibitive. And so identifying the points in the experience or the journey of how something unfolds where your brand, the particular service engagement that you're designing needs to really nail it is a great way of prioritizing the places to devote your energy. And you can let other things slip to the place where they're fine.
Yeah.
Like if they're really bad, that's not great. But if they're not the highlight, that's also fine. So
we were talking about one experience that you worked on in prep for this about a hotel.
Indeed.
And I thought it was a really nice example of like what matters for one brand might not matter so much for another.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work in hospitality, and one of the brands that we're working with was focused on business travelers. And so if you're a frequent business traveler, as I suspect many of you on the session are, walking in and having the person step around the front of the counter and welcome you and tell you all the amenities of the hotel for the 86th time is probably pretty annoying. So the brand that we're working with, we de-featured that initial arrival moment into the lobby and that front desk experience, and highlighted the arrival to the room moment where you can have this exhale and you're here. So just essentially knowing where to prioritize the focus of your design attention is really important.
Yeah. And then I know I've seen you do some really interesting things where you're stretching and helping a design team really push the boundaries. So you've identified some moments that matter. You've got things mapped over time, but then as you're making and creating and getting tangible, what are some ways you help teams kind of push the boundaries of how they might think about things?
I think a really simple one is asking people to think about all the kinds of media that they can play with, and trying to develop design solutions that prioritize one media over all the others. So by that I mean, what if you could only deliver it with people? What if you could only deliver it with signage and communications, or only through the sort of cues that the space gives you about how you move through an experience? And interestingly, going back to some of the healthcare environments that we've been talking about, organizations will tend to have a bias, I think, towards certain media. So again, in healthcare, usually the response is, great, whose job is that going to be to do that thing? And it's like, actually, people are incredibly expensive. They're super busy, and they're quite distracted on things like, delivering care. And so what if you, in an environment like that, you said, let's just purely do it through signage, like the Journey home board, for instance, or let's do it purely through digital communications or whatever it might be. So pushing it to be the most essential version of a single medium, I think, is an interesting mechanism.
Well, just starting to pull in some questions from those of you in our community this morning. Jiraj is asking about designing a digital or a virtual service. And I'm wondering how you've seen this extend into that space over time, or stories that come to mind of those aspects of a service. I know we think about digital and interaction design as yet another layer of things.
One of the things that I think we spend a lot of time on when we're designing service experiences is thinking about tone and sort of like, what's on brand, what's overbearing, what's too quiet, what's too subtle, what's not subtle enough. And I think digital service delivery, because it is so relatively easy to connect with an end consumer who's receiving that service, I think things like tone become really, really important, because there's so many other things that are competing for that headspace that actually feel like a welcomed ping, if you will, is really important.
I can think of a great example of that, which is one of my favorite pieces of work that IDEO ever got to work on is bedsider.org. So this was a piece of work for a group working toward preventing unplanned prevency in adults. And so it was this entire educational service about all of your options for preventing unwanted, unplanned pregnancies. And some of the things, tone was absolutely critical. Everything was delivered digitally. It was a resource, an education, heavy video, mobile, all online, but tone and the design of that experience was absolutely critical. So in the early stages of that experience, we were trying to have conversations with people to figure out how the tone could be less like, that's not the way, that's not what you should be doing, and a little more like, hey, you're a modern woman in the modern world. Here are resources to support your life and increase your health and increase the ways that you want to live. Saying that in just the right way was key. And so we literally prototyped text streams and had a bunch of different tones that we were trying out a little more cheeky, a little more sisterly, a little more best friend, a little more like favorite auntie, a little more mom, you know, and we had like these different personas that we had conversations with different people, kind of A, B, C, D testing different tones. And it was so great. We've done something very similar with parents and education in Brazil, and really feeling out very low resolution. What does the language feel like in a digital experience for that service?
One other thought there is the sort of requirement for response, I think, is also a really interesting thing. So, you know, navigating a website for an extended period of time to understand a narrative versus having a quick text exchange, and those kinds of the appropriateness and the bigness of those, the use of those channels across a digital experience, I think, is also a really interesting thing to prototype.
Yeah. So there are a couple questions we have around feedback and honing. So Sundeep is asking us, how do you identify the moments that matter? How do you figure out which ones you want to lift up and focus on a little bit more than others?
Well, certainly the way IDEO does it is that we spend a lot of time investing in understanding what's important to the people that are going to be consuming that service or participating in, and then sometimes creating that service relationship. And so going out and spending time in people's lives, understanding the things that excite them, understanding the things that irritate them. So for instance, going back to the business traveler hotel, like literally the 86th time that the person walks around from the front desk and welcomes you grandly into this chandelier filled lobby where you're just like, okay, enough. You start to get cues from the ways that people are actually consuming your service offer or similar service offers that are out there. And then prototyping itself is an incredibly important way for understanding what lands appropriately, what feels missing, especially when it's a service offer that doesn't yet exist in the world, which I think, this is going to sound very simple, but a medium that IDEO uses a lot is movies. So when we're trying to show someone an experience that they might have in the future that they don't have a lot of references for today, essentially depicting how that might play out over time in a narrative form, and then getting feedback to that. What felt valuable, what felt over the top, what didn't feel clear, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think another aspect also picking what matters most, certainly what the end user wants, but also there's some questions about personas, like what personas or segments are you prioritizing as an organization? There's always give and take and a gray zone in this, but who are the most important customers, or what are new customers that you want to attract? What's on for your strategy or not? What's possible with your capabilities? So there are certainly times where I've been in a room with a client team and we have a brilliant idea, but it's not any set of capabilities that organization has. We have to hold that and reflect on, is it worth it to build those capabilities tomorrow or 5 years from now? And then is that maybe not the moment that needs to matter most? Or do we need to pull it forward? So I think it's a lot of conversations, a lot of trade-offs, and a lot of them happen when you're in the midst of experiencing or just after experiencing a prototype.
That's right. Because exactly. Because you'll start to have that dialogue between what feels right and aspirational and what feels possible. And that doesn't mean that things that feel aspirational but not possible need to be taken off the table. They just may need to be developed toward over time.
Yeah. I can see we have a couple questions from Aaron about how does this extend into B2B service, or when your clients are another company or another enterprise? And have you worked on things like that?
Yeah, definitely. Business customers are people too, is the first thing I would say. And they have needs and they have workflows and they have priorities and things that are motivating them and incentives that they're operating within that are as real as any end consumer is. And so I think actually the approach is very, very similar. And IDEO's done quite a bit of work in that kind of space. Like, for instance, new insurance products that are sold not just to not to end consumers, but to corporate buyers and things like that. There, where the process by which somebody learns about, gets curious about, begins to understand, situate something in their lives, and then make a commitment to it. All of those kinds of circumstances are entirely designable, whether for an end consumer or for a business client.
Mm-hmm. I know one piece of work that was going on in our San Francisco studio probably a couple of years back. We talked with financial services, but it wasn't direct to consumer. It was to other people providing people financial advice. So a lot of small businesses talking to this one large business. And so the medium that we prototyped in was the customer support center. We've done that so many times where it's the script is what we're prototyping with when somebody picks up a phone in a B2B environment. And I think that one was so much fun. And I've done it also in the space of financial services and insurance, where we've said that what if we took this call center and just for a few days took off the dominant metric of number of calls that you can finish in 1 hour, and instead started to look at something like net promoter score or satisfaction with the service instead. And so really quickly in a B2B environment, you can play out some of these same scenarios and start to look for indicators that something could be improved.
Yeah. I think in that case, when you start to ask yourself, what are the moments that matter? It's perhaps as much about the construct within which people are working. So for instance, in a call center environment, if somebody receives a call, the process by which things get escalated, or they can tap the network of people around them and gain, essentially act smarter than they as an individual might be, the sort of mechanisms that allow for that to happen are eminently designable. So thinking about those moments where something might need to transition from an individual's responsibility to a group responsibility, or from a dialogue to a group conversation, those kinds of things can become really powerful.
Nice. Yeah. Doug has a question here that I think will be fun to tackle. So he's working in government and just about to start prototyping policy changes.
Oh, cool.
And we talk a lot about what are the conditions, what are the rules, what are the guidelines. So I'd be keen to hear any experiences about prototyping policy. How do you test? Do the rules feel fair? If we change this rule, what happens? And so I'm curious to think with you about some of the things we've done. We've definitely done a lot of government work in the nation of Singapore and the US and a couple of other nations. So
policy design is really interesting because from the standpoint, you get very long loops of feedback before you know whether or not the shift in policy is actually creating the effect that you wanted. In a lot of cases, IDEO's been involved in service design work with our government clients, and we're actually doing that work simultaneously with policy development. So essentially saying, if this is the kind of offer we want to create for the consumption of our citizenry, what then would be the encircling set of policies that create the conditions for that service to be delivered effectively? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a dialogue, right? It's a dialogue between the actual services that you're delivering and the policies that you're creating. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. And I think it's actually sort of interesting to maybe play out scenarios for a given policy concept, which would say, if this were true, in combination with the other policies that are around it and the services through which that policy gets enacted, what would we imagine if we shifted it this way, or shifted it that way, or shifted it a third way?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm reflecting on is that things like policies, organizations, incentives, these are all the structures that can help a single service design prototype really scale and really have impact over larger and larger numbers of people, which of course governments are always wonderfully concerned with. And so I think there are certain things that start to extend out to that larger organization or that larger system, but that the service design can inform. And so I think some of the things we might do is, after prototyping the service, how do you dial up the right conversation? Can you bring the people in charge of the policies or the organizational aspects through that service design? And then you host that different conversation, or, as Ilya was saying, ask a slightly different question about what are the guidelines or policies that need to be in place for this long term. I know we have tons of questions, and we're trying to get through as many as we can. We just have a few minutes left. And so there was one that is really near and dear to our hearts about processes like this. Prototyping, taking the time to bring people through, are often seen as speed bumps. The fast pace of progress that's needed. That happens equally in for-profit institutions as well as nonprofit. And so what are some of the ways, if you were having a conversation with the senior leaders in a company, what's the argument you would make for why to take time to do these processes, and what are the benefits?
I think it's a conversation that's quite related to the difference between an agile process and a waterfall process, and not just with regards to technology, but I think very often our clients come to us and say, we'd love to do something really different in the future, but we can't actually manage to take the time to stop and pause to really think it through. And from our perspective, the slowing down, so to speak, in order to take the time to create optionality for the decisions that you want to make, where the information is richer. So it's not just in spreadsheet form, it's not just in described form, it's in experienceable form, actually makes the decision-making process much faster. And it lessens the possibility or the likelihood of rework, in the sense that if what you're trying to do is create a perfectly agreed to version of some future form that you've not actually tried in the world, the likelihood of getting that right is so low that prototyping actually de-risks in a relatively low cost and actually much faster form. Honestly, it's a counterintuitive argument in a lot of ways, but one thing that we've done with clients, or oftentimes clients have done with us, is they've tried to run their normal process alongside ours. Mm-hmm. And typically we found that we get to sort of richer, stronger solutions that don't require as much rework more quickly.
Yeah. So always hard to make time for. And so it's about picking the right moments to lean in and take the time and space for these processes. I think also we talk a lot about double delivery, do it the normal way. And then can you take one day to get people together and pull things off? Yeah. I think one more thing we want to share is that we have something new on IDEO. So this is very much to inform people and help them think about ways that are from ideas to action. Course can help them, which will be starting up again on November 8th. But we also have something new that we're very excited about. We have a Foundations in Design Thinking certification that now, if people come in, and we have 2 courses that together will provide you with a great foundation to start practicing design thinking. So our Insights for Innovation course, coupled with From Ideas to Action, certainly you can take them in that order or flip it around and take ideation and prototyping first. But these 2 courses, this is something that's very new. We've just launched it from IDEO, and we're very excited to help more people get deeper capabilities so that they can practice this in their own work and bring this to their own lives and their own organizations. So with that, I just want to say thank you to Ilya for joining us here. This was a great conversation. We'll share this out more broadly, and we'll have more questions answered for you soon. Have a great day.